The gavel cracked like a bone in her soul, the final judicial snap that severed her from the man she'd called her life. Across the sterile courtroom, Alara did not flinch. She sat, a statue of quiet dignity in a cheap wool coat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while inside the world was ash. He had taken everything, the house, the security, the future they'd painted in soft, hopeful colors, leaving her with nothing but the echoing silence of a childless home and a heart scooped raw. At that exact moment, in a pristine penthouse office that overlooked the city like a kingdom, Kalen Thorne was receiving a verdict of his own. "It's a near statistical impossibility, Mr. Thorne," the doctor said, his voice muffled by the weight of expensive art and thicker carpets. "The legacy you've built biologically, it ends with you." The words, asterisk childless asterisk, hung in the air, more damning than any financial loss. He was a titan who commanded empires, yet he could not create the one thing that truly mattered. Their worlds, one of shattered poverty and one of sterile wealth, were orbits destined to collide. It happened at a charity gala he funded for single mothers, a cause his advisors told him was bad optics. Kalen saw her there, not as a supplicant, but as a volunteer, her eyes holding a universe of pain, yet her spine straight as she guided others. He saw the resilience in the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, a simple gesture of order in a chaotic life. And against all expectation, against the whispers of his board and the logic of his world, he chose her. He walked through the crowd, a shark moving through minnows, and stopped before Alara. He did not offer a hand. He offered a look of stark, unnerving recognition. "You have been broken," he said, his voice low, "and yet you are the strongest person in this room." Can you imagine sitting in the ruins of your life and having a stranger, a king from a castle you've never seen, see not your rubble but your foundation? To understand the shock of his choice, you had to know her fire. Alara's past was not just one abandonment but a series of quiet surrenders. She had worked 2 jobs to put her husband through law school, eating canned soup so he could wear silk ties. She had held his hand through his father's funeral, through his professional failures, building him up with her own worn-down hands. The betrayal was not that he left, but how asterisk, a text message, an emptied bank account, and the cold legal papers that declared her a redundant accessory to the life she had built for him. She had endured not with screaming matches, but with a quiet fortitude that was her only remaining possession. And Kalen, his story was a gilded cage. He had risen from nothing, a boy from the Rust Belt who turned a single, desperate idea into a global conglomerate. He had amassed fortunes, dated heiresses and starlets, but every relationship was a transaction. They saw his money, his power, his name. None saw the lonely man inside the fortress, a man who stared at the family portraits in his rivals' offices not with envy for their wealth, but with a hollow ache for their children's laughter. His legacy was a skyscraper, with no one to inherit the view. This was the moral turning point. Kalen did not approach Alara with a contract, but with a covenant. In his study, surrounded by the spoils of his conquests, he made his shocking proposal. "I have spent a lifetime looking for someone I can trust," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Not with my money, but with my future. I do not offer you pity. I offer you a partnership. I have seen your strength, your honor. I want you to carry my legacy. I am choosing you because of your worth, not your womb." It was a decision that defied reason, a moral gamble on the character of a woman the world had discarded. The romantic development was not born of grand gestures, but of quiet immersion. Kalen, for the first time in decades, stepped out of his tower. He sat in her tiny, sun-faded kitchen and drank her bitter, instant coffee. He listened as she spoke of her mother's illness, of the shame of grocery shopping with coupons, of the simple dream of a garden. He didn't solve her problems with a check. He simply listened, his respect for her growing with every shared vulnerability. She, in turn, began to trust the man who was vulnerable enough to admit his own deep human longing. Their bond was built in the space between words, in the shared understanding of profound loss. The emotional climax arrived not as a clinical success but as a sacred dawn. When the doctor confirmed the pregnancy and the ultrasound revealed 2 flickering heartbeats, twins, The air left the room not in a gasp, but in a reverent hush. Kalen, the untouchable tycoon, fell to his knees before Alara, his face buried in her lap, his shoulders shaking with silent, healing sobs. And Alara, the abandoned wife, cradled his head, her own tears falling onto his hair, tears not of sorrow, but of a redemption so profound it felt like a rebirth. It was a miracle that healed them both, mending his lineage and her faith in one double-beat miracle. If you were her, having lost everything, would you have had the courage to trust again, to believe in a love that arrived not as a rescue, but as a recognition? Now, years later, the legacy they build is not measured in stock portfolios, but in bedtime stories and scraped knees. The Thorn Foundation for Abandoned Women bears Alara's name and her empathetic touch. In their home, filled with the joyous chaos of two dark-haired children, Kalen watches his wife. She stands in their garden, the one she always dreamed of, her posture still one of unassailable dignity, but now her face is softened by a peace that is deep and earned. He supports her not with loud proclamations, but with a quiet, unwavering presence, a partner in every sense. They built a family not on the sands of convenience or the rocks of cold contracts, but on the sacred, fertile ground of mutual respect and a love that was forged in the fires of their shared brokenness. Their story proves that sometimes the most powerful legacy is not what you build for yourself, but what you build from the pieces you never thought you could use again. If this tale of redemption and resilience moved you, if you believe in second chances and the power of quiet strength, let us know in the comments below. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more narratives that remind us that our lowest endings can be the start of our greatest beginnings. The garden was her sanctuary, a tapestry of color and life she had woven with her own hands, a stark contrast to the barren concrete patio of her old life. Here, amidst the lavender and climbing roses, the ghosts of her past held no power. The laughter of the twins, a boy and a girl with Kalen's serious eyes and her own resilient spirit, was the only echo that mattered. They tumbled on the grass, their shrieks of joy a symphony that filled the spaces in her heart she once believed would remain hollow forever. Kalen watched them from his study, the financial reports on his screen forgotten. His greatest acquisition was not a company or a patent, but this view, this life. He remembered the cold precision of his world before her, a world of calculated risks and emotional dividends that never paid out. He had offered her a contract, but she had handed him back a soul. Stepping away from the window, he walked into the sunlight, his approach quiet. He didn't sweep the children into his arms with boisterous energy. Instead, he knelt, becoming part of their world, listening to their breathless, jumbled stories about ladybugs and epic adventures. His gaze then lifted to Alara, and in that silent exchange was a universe of understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the miracle they had co-authored. This was the legacy. It was in the foundation they'd built in her name, a place that offered not just shelter, but the same dignified hand-up she had been given. It was in the way he deferred to her wisdom on matters of the heart and home, his billion-dollar instincts humbled by her innate sense of what was right. And it was in the way she, once afraid to trust the ground beneath her feet, now stood upon it with an unshakable strength, her past not a chain but a lesson. Their love story was never a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. It was a choice, remade every single day, to honor the broken parts of each other, to find beauty not in spite of the scars, but because of them. The twins were not just heirs to a fortune. They were the living, breathing proof that from the deepest loss can bloom the most profound joy, and that the most valuable trusts are not written in legal ink, but in the human heart. Of course, here is the continuation. The true weight of their legacy was felt not in the quiet moments, but in the storms. When their daughter, Lyra, developed a fierce and unexplained fever that refused to break, the old ghosts whispered at the edges of Alara's mind. This was the kind of loss she was familiar with, the cruel, random snatching away of joy. She sat in the sterile pediatric ward, the scent of antiseptic a vile trigger, her body rigid with a terror she had sworn she'd left behind. This was the test. Would he, the man of empires and absolutes, crumble in the face of this helpless uncertainty? Kalen did not crumble. He did not make frantic calls to specialists or try to buy a solution. He simply pulled a chair beside her, his large, capable hand enveloping her cold, trembling one. He sat with her in the dread, a silent sentinel against the past. He didn't promise her it would be okay. He simply promised her she wouldn't be alone in it. And in that shared, breathless vigil, as the monitors beeped their steady, reassuring rhythm through the night, Alara realized this was the final, fragile piece of her healing. She was not just loved in triumph. She was loved in terror. She was partnered in the dark. When the fever broke at dawn, painting Lyra's cheeks with a healthy pink, their relief was a quiet, profound thing. Kalen pressed a kiss to his daughter's damp forehead, then one to his wife's tear-streaked cheek. The fortress around his heart, built over a lifetime of solitude, was not just occupied. It was gone, replaced by something vulnerable and infinitely stronger. Can you imagine finding a love that doesn't just celebrate your strength, but courageously guards your fragility? Their story became a quiet legend in the city, but not for the reasons the gossips preferred. It was in the way Kalen Thorne, at the apex of his career, began to decline meetings that conflicted with school plays. It was in the sight of Alara, once a phantom in a courtroom, now standing at the helm of her foundation, her voice calm and unwavering as she championed women whose stories mirrored her own past. She didn't offer them charity. She offered them a mirror, showing them their own hidden strength, just as Kalen had once shown her. Years later, on the sprawling lawn of the estate that was now a home, they watched their twins, no longer children, teaching a wobbly-legged puppy a new trick. The setting sun cast the scene in gold. Kalen slipped his arm around Alara's waist, drawing her back against him. There were no words needed. The legacy was there, in the untamed laughter, in the deep, settled peace between them, in the knowledge that the greatest wealth was not in having everything, but in having everything with asterisk someone. Theirs was a love built on the ruins of two broken histories, a testament to the fact that the most beautiful futures are not those that are born perfect, but those that are bravely, tenderly rebuilt, piece by sacred piece together. If this journey from desolate courtrooms to sun-drenched gardens has reminded you that your own story is still being written, we'd be honored if you'd share your thoughts below. Your comments fuel our community, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Your next story of redemption and resilience is waiting. The gavel cracked, a sound so final it seemed to sever the very air in the stuffy, wood-paneled courtroom. To Alara, it was the sound of her life breaking in two. She sat perfectly still, a statue of quiet dignity in a second-hand wool coat, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if in prayer. Inside, however, a universe was collapsing into ash. Across the aisle, the man she had called her husband for 12 years, the man whose dreams she had fed with her own ambition and sweat, refused to meet her gaze. He was already looking toward the door, toward the future he had built on the wreckage of hers. He had taken everything: the suburban house with the wilting rose bushes, the joint bank accounts now hollowed out, the fragile security of a shared life, leaving her with nothing but the echoing, cavernous silence of a childless home and a heart that had been scooped raw. Can you imagine? Sitting there in the hard, unforgiving wooden pew, the scent of lemon polish and despair thick in the air, and realizing the person who swore to cherish you has rendered you a legal footnote, a problem to be neatly resolved and filed away. At that precise moment, in a pristine, soundproofed penthouse office that overlooked the city like a kingdom of steel and glass, Kalen Thorne was receiving a verdict of his own. "It's a near statistical impossibility, Mr. Thorne," the doctor said, his voice muffled by the weight of million-dollar art and carpets thick enough to swallow sound. "The treatments, even the most experimental, the legacy you've built, biologically, it ends with you." The word childless hung in the air between them, more damning than any stock market crash or hostile takeover. He was Kalen Thorne, a titan who commanded global empires with a phone call, whose name opened doors and shattered competitors, yet he could not create the one thing that truly, primally mattered: a child, an heir, a piece of himself to outlast the cold marble of his mausoleum. Their worlds, one of shattered poverty and one of sterile, gilded wealth, were orbits destined for a violent, life-altering collision. It happened months later, at a charity gala for single mothers, a cause his board of directors had told him was bad optics. Kalen, in a fit of defiance against the soulless machine of his own life, had funded it lavishly. He moved through the crowd of well-heeled philanthropists and cautiously hopeful women, a shark moving through minnows, his presence causing a ripple of adjusted ties and nervous smiles. And then he saw her. Not as a supplicant but as a volunteer, her simple navy dress a stark contrast to the sequined gowns around her. She was guiding an elderly woman to a seat, her hand gentle on the woman's elbow, her focus complete. But it was her eyes that arrested him. They held a universe of freshly endured pain, a deep and abiding sorrow, and yet her spine was straight as a ruler, her chin lifted not in defiance, but in a quiet, unassailable dignity. He saw the resilience in the way she tucked a stray strand of honey-brown hair behind her ear, a simple, graceful gesture of maintaining order in a life that had been plunged into chaos. And against all expectation, against the whispered logic of his entire world, he chose her. He walked directly through the crowd, ignoring a senator vying for his attention, and stopped before Alara. He did not offer a hand or a smile. He simply looked at her, his gaze a physical weight, stark and unnerving in its intensity. "You have been broken," he said, his voice low, a rumble that bypassed her ears and vibrated in her very bones. "I can see it, and yet you are the strongest person in this room." Alara flinched, the words landing like a blow. For a year she had been treated as a victim, a sob story, an object of pity. No one had ever named her strength. She met his gaze, her own eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a flicker of something she thought had died, a spark of recognition. "I'm just trying to help," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I know," Kalen replied, his gaze never wavering. "That is precisely the point." To understand the sheer, seismic shock of his choice, you had to know the texture of her fire, the specific, grinding details of her ruin. Alara's past was not a single, clean abandonment, but a series of quiet, brutal surrenders. She had worked 2 jobs, waitressing by day, typing legal briefs by night, to put her husband, David, through law school. She had eaten canned soup and worn thrift store coats so he could possess a collection of silk ties. She had held his hand through his father's funeral, through his professional failures, building him up with her own worn-down hands, her belief in him the mortar that held his fragile ego together. The betrayal was not that he left, but how. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a text message sent while she was at her mother, helping the frail woman bathe. "This isn't working. I've moved out. My lawyer will be in touch." Then the silence, the emptied bank accounts, the cold, precise legal papers served to her at the diner, declaring her a redundant accessory to the very life she had painstakingly built for him. He had used the law she helped him master to dismember her existence. She had endured it all not with screaming matches or public scenes, but with a quiet, granite fortitude that was, in the end, her only remaining possession. She was a woman stripped of everything but her own unyielding core. And Kalen, his story was a gilded cage of a different design. He had risen from the gritty, post-industrial decay of the Rust Belt, a boy with a hungry mind and a single, desperate idea he'd nursed in a cramped, damp bedroom. He had turned that idea into a global conglomerate, amassing a fortune so vast it was an abstraction. He had dated heiresses whose smiles were as calculated as stock options, and starlets who saw his power as a glittering accessory. Every relationship was a transaction, a negotiation. They saw his money, his influence, his name. None saw the lonely man inside the impenetrable fortress, a man who would stare at the family portraits in his rivals' offices not with envy for their wealth, but with a hollow, aching void where a child's laughter should have been. His legacy was a magnificent, towering skyscraper with no one to inherit the view. This was the moral turning point, the moment that defied all convention. Kalen did not approach Alara with a contract, but with a covenant. He had her discreetly brought to his office, a space that felt more like a museum of his success than a living room. He did not sit behind the intimidating acreage of his desk. He sat opposite her in a low chair, making himself vulnerable. "I have spent a lifetime," he began, his voice stripped of its usual command, "looking for someone I can trust. Not with my money, any competent accountant can do that, but with my future. I have seen your strength, Ilara. I have seen your honor in the face of profound dishonor. I do not offer you pity. I offer you a partnership. I want you to carry my legacy. I am choosing you because of your intrinsic worth, not your womb." The air left Ilara's lungs. It was a proposal so shocking, so morally audacious, it felt less like an offer and more like a destiny. He wasn't seeking a surrogate. He was seeking a queen for a kingdom he feared would turn to dust. He was gambling his entire bloodline on the character of a woman the world had deemed worthless. The romantic development that followed was not born of grand, cinematic gestures, but of 1,000 quiet, humble immersions. Kalen, for the first time in decades, stepped out of his tower. He appeared at the door of her tiny, walk-up apartment, with its sun-faded curtains and the persistent smell of her neighbor's cabbage. He sat in her rickety kitchen and drank her bitter, instant coffee without a flinch. He listened, truly listened, as she spoke of her mother's slow, expensive decline into dementia, of the hot shame of grocery shopping with a fistful of coupons, of the simple, almost childish dream she'd always harbored for a garden, a patch of earth to call her own. He didn't immediately solve these problems with a wave of his checkbook. He simply bore witness. He learned the geography of her struggle, and his respect for her grew with every shared vulnerability, every unvarnished truth. She, in turn, began to trust the man who was vulnerable enough to admit his own deep human longing, who wasn't ashamed to show her the empty nursery he'd had built in his penthouse, a room that had never known the sound of a cry. Their bond was built not in ballrooms, but in the silent, sacred space between words, in the shared, profound understanding of what it means to have a fundamental part of your humanity feel missing. The emotional climax arrived not as a sterile, clinical success, but as a sacred, trembling dawn. The process had been careful, medical, overseen by the best fertility doctors money could secure. But the moment itself transcended all transaction. When the doctor confirmed the pregnancy, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile, and the ultrasound wand moved over her stomach to reveal two distinct, flickering heartbeats, twins, the air left the room not in a gasp, but in a reverent, awed hush. Kalen, the untouchable tycoon, the man of iron and ice, fell to his knees right there on the polished clinic floor before Ilara. He wrapped his arms around her waist, his face buried against the soft cotton of her dress, and his shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs of a lifetime of pent-up hope and fear finally released. And Ilara, the abandoned wife, the woman who believed her body was a failure, cradled his head, her own tears falling onto his thick, dark hair, tears not of sorrow, but of a redemption so profound it felt like a rebirth. This was their miracle, a double-beat miracle that was mending his fractured lineage and her shattered faith in one glorious, impossible moment. If you were her, sitting in that courtroom with nothing, would you have had the courage to say yes? To trust a stranger with your body, your future, your very soul, based on a look in his eyes that promised not just a child, but a restoration of your very self? The pregnancy was a time of quiet, profound transformation. Kalen was relentlessly, almost ferociously attentive. He read pregnancy books with the same focus he gave quarterly reports, his brow furrowed in concentration. He learned to cook her simple, comforting meals, his large, capable hands, which usually orchestrated billion-dollar deals, now gently chopping vegetables in her small kitchen. He rubbed her swollen feet, his touch reverent, and talked to the growing lives within her, his voice a low, steady murmur telling them stories of the world they would inherit, a world he was determined to make softer, kinder for their sake. Ilara bloomed. The harsh lines of worry and grief that had etched themselves onto her face began to soften, replaced by a radiant inner peace. The childless home was now filled with the rustle of preparation, with the delivery of tiny clothes, with the scent of fresh paint in the nursery that was no longer a tomb of hopes, but a cradle of dreams. She wasn't just carrying his children. She was carrying their shared future, and the weight of it was not a burden, but a privilege that straightened her spine even further. The birth was a marathon of pain and power. Kalen never left her side, his hand a constant anchor in the storm, his face pale but resolute, whispering words of encouragement that were for her ears only. When their son, Liam, entered the world with a furious, indignant cry followed moments later by their daughter, Ilara, named for the mother who had found her strength anew, the world shifted on its axis. The doctor placed the squirming, perfect infants on Ilara's chest, and Kalen looked from his children to the woman who had given them to him, his heart so full he thought it might stop. In that moment, he was not a billionaire. He was simply a man, witnessing a miracle. Now, years later, the legacy they built is not measured in stock portfolios or corporate acquisitions, but in bedtime stories and scraped knees, in the chaotic, joyful clutter of a family home. The Thorn Foundation for Abandoned Women, which bore Ilara's name and was guided by her deep, hard-won empathy, had become a powerful force for change, offering legal aid, housing, and most importantly, the message of dignity she herself had embodied. In their home, filled with the sound of children's laughter and the happy barking of a golden retriever puppy, Kalen often paused to watch his wife. She would be in her garden, the one she had always dreamed of, now a vibrant, sprawling testament to her care, her hands deep in the soil, her face softened by a peace that was deep and earned. He supported her not with loud proclamations or extravagant gifts, but with a quiet, unwavering presence, a partner in every sense of the word. He was the man who now left the office at 5 sharp to coach Liam's soccer team, who patiently braided little Ilara's hair, his large fingers surprisingly deft. Their love was a tapestry woven with threads of grief and hope, of betrayal and trust, of loneliness and profound connection. It was not a perfect, seamless fabric, but its imperfections were its strength, each frayed thread and contrasting color telling the story of their journey. They had built a family not on the shifting sands of convenience or the cold, hard rocks of a legal contract, but on the sacred, fertile ground of mutual respect, and a love that had been forged, tempered, and proven in the fires of their shared brokenness. Their story proves, in the most visceral way, that the most powerful legacy is not what you build for yourself, but what you build from the pieces you never thought you could use again. It is a testament to the idea that our greatest endings can be stolen from us, only to make room for a beginning we never dared to imagine. The true weight of this legacy, however, was felt not in the golden, peaceful afternoons, but in the sudden, terrifying storms. When their daughter, Ilara, their little Lara, developed a fierce and unexplained fever just after her 5th birthday, a fever that spiked and held for 3 agonizing days, the old, cold ghosts came whispering back at the edges of Ilara's mind. This was the kind of loss she was intimately familiar with, the cruel, random, and utterly senseless snatching away of joy. It was the universe's favorite trick, and she was its perfect mark. She sat in the sterile, beeping silence of the pediatric ICU, the scent of antiseptic a vile, triggering perfume. Her body was rigid, a statue once more, but this time carved from pure terror. This was the test, the one she had always feared would come. Would the foundation of this new life crack under the first real pressure? Would he, the man of empires and absolutes, the solver of impossible problems, crumble in the face of this primal, helpless uncertainty? Would he retreat into the cold, efficient shell she knew he possessed, treating their daughter's illness as another corporate crisis to be managed? Kalen did not crumble. He did not make frantic calls to a dozen more world-renowned specialists. He did not try to buy a solution or bark orders at the nurses. He simply pulled a stiff, vinyl-covered chair so close to hers that their arms touched. He sat down, his large, capable hand enveloping her cold, trembling one, his warmth a slow infusion of strength. He sat with her in the dread. He was a silent, immovable sentinel against the past that threatened to swallow her whole. He didn't offer hollow platitudes or promise her it would be okay. He simply promised, with the pressure of his hand and the steady rhythm of his breathing, that she would not be alone in it, that they would face this, too, together. And in that shared, breathless vigil, as the monitors beeped their steady, hypnotic rhythm through the long, dark night, Alara realized this was the final, fragile piece of her healing. This was the moment she truly, completely trusted. She was not just loved in triumph, she was loved in terror. She was partnered in the dark. Her strength was not something she had to wield alone anymore. It was now part of a greater, shared fortitude. When the fever broke at dawn, painting Lara's cheeks with a healthy, blessed pink, their relief was a quiet, profound, almost holy thing. Kalen, his own eyes shadowed with exhaustion, first pressed a long, tender kiss to his daughter's damp forehead, and then turned and pressed another, just as tender, to his wife's tear-streaked cheek. The last vestiges of the fortress around his heart, the one built over a lifetime of solitary ambition and emotional solitude, were not just occupied. They were gone, dissolved, replaced by something vulnerable and infinitely stronger. Can you imagine finding a love that doesn't just celebrate your strength but courageously, steadfastly guards your fragility, that sees your terror and doesn't flinch but stands as your shield? Their story became a quiet legend in the city, but not for the reasons the society pages and gossips preferred. It was whispered about in boardrooms, but the details were all wrong. The true legend was lived in the small, daily choices. It was in the way Kalen Thorne, at the very apex of his power and influence, began to systematically decline high-stakes international meetings that conflicted with school plays and soccer games. It was in the now common sight of Alara Thorne, once a phantom of pity in a courtroom, standing confidently at the helm of her foundation's annual gala, her voice calm and unwavering as she championed women whose stories were heartbreakingly familiar. She didn't offer them charity. She offered them a mirror, showing them the reflection of their own hidden, unyielding strength, just as Kalen had once, miraculously, shown her. Years later, on the sprawling, emerald lawn of the estate that was now, truly and completely, a asterisk home, they watched their twins, no longer children but on the cusp of adolescence, teaching a wobbly-legged, enthusiastic Labrador puppy a new trick. The setting sun cast the entire scene in a liquid honeyed gold, gilding the children's laughing faces and the dog's lolling tongue. Kalen, his hair now silvered at the temples, slipped his arm around Alara's waist, drawing her back against the solid, familiar strength of his chest. Her head rested naturally in the hollow of his shoulder. There were no words needed. The legacy was there, alive and breathing, in the untamed, joyous laughter ringing across the grass, in the deep, settled, and unshakable peace that flowed between them, in the profound, hard-won knowledge that the greatest wealth was not in having everything, but in having everything with asterisk someone. Their love, this improbable, magnificent edifice, was built on the ruins of two broken histories. It was a living testament, a monument to the fact that the most beautiful and enduring futures are not those that are born perfect, but those that are bravely, tenderly, and deliberately rebuilt, piece by sacred piece together. It was a story that was still being written, with every shared glance, every held hand, every quiet morning, its final chapter a long, long way off, and all the more precious for it. The story of Alara and Kalen is not one that truly ends, for a legacy woven from resilience and love does not have a final page, but rather, it breathes and grows with each passing season. The golden afternoon on the lawn bled into 1,000 more, each one layering upon the last, building a life so rich, and textured that the early chapters of pain read like a distant, hazy dream. The twins, Liam and Lara, grew like saplings in the sun, strong, vibrant, and deeply rooted in the unique soil of their family. Liam possessed his father's analytical mind and quiet intensity, but it was tempered by his mother's empathy. He was the child who would notice a classmate sitting alone and, without fanfare, bring them into his game. He asked profound questions about the world, his serious gray eyes, so like Kaelin's, missing nothing. Lara was all fire and fierce compassion, a whirlwind of creativity and emotion. She had her mother's resilience, a stubborn light that refused to be dimmed, and her father's latent protectiveness, especially toward her brother and her mother. She was the one who staged elaborate plays in the garden, who wept over injured birds, and who argued with a lawyer's precision for a later bedtime. Their home was not a silent, museum-like penthouse, but a living, breathing entity. The pristine white sofas were replaced with deep, comfortable ones in earthy tones, often strewn with a child's sketchbook or a dog-eared novel. The grand piano in the corner was not for show. It was where Lara practiced with passionate, if not always perfectly tuned, fervor, and where Liam would sometimes sit beside Kaelin, listening as his father picked out the simple melodies of his own Rust Belt childhood. Alara's garden expanded, becoming a small, thriving ecosystem of raised vegetable beds, cutting flowers, and quiet, hidden benches where a person could simply sit and be. Kaelin's transformation was the most profound. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with a look now found himself being negotiated with by a 5-year-old over the merits of broccoli. And he often lost. He discovered a bottomless patience he never knew he possessed. He spent Saturday afternoons on his knees, helping Liam build impossibly complex Lego castles, the corporate titan completely subsumed by the father, his focus absolute. He learned to braid Lara's hair, his large, deft fingers eventually mastering the intricate French braids she loved, their morning ritual a sacred, quiet time of connection. He was still Kaelin Thorne, the formidable businessman. He could still dismantle a hostile takeover with cold, ruthless efficiency. But that man was now a suit he wore for part of the day. The real man, the core of him, was here, in this noisy, messy, loving home. Alara watched this metamorphosis with a heart so full it ached. She saw the way he looked at their children, not as heirs to an empire, but as the miraculous, living answers to a lifelong prayer. And in his eyes when he looked at her, she saw not just love, but a reverence, a gratitude so deep it was humbling. She had given him this. She had not just carried his children, she had opened the door to this entire world of feeling he had been locked out of. Her own work with the foundation became her mission, her calling. She didn't just lend her name, she lent her story, her heart, her time. She sat in small, brightly lit community centers with women whose eyes mirrored her own from years past, hollowed out by betrayal, shimmering with unshed tears. She didn't offer them pity or empty platitudes. "I know the taste of that silence," she would say, her voice soft but clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I know the feeling of the ground disappearing beneath your feet, and I am here to tell you it comes back. You find a new ground and you build on it yourself, brick by brick, and it is stronger because you built it." She implemented programs that focused on practical skills, financial literacy, resume building, interview techniques. But she also started support groups, art therapy sessions, and a mentorship program that paired women starting out with those further along the path. The foundation became renowned not just for its financial clout, but for its profound, tangible success in restoring not just solvency, but soul. One evening, about a decade after the twins were born, Kaelin found her in her study, poring over architectural plans for a new foundation shelter, one designed to feel like a home, not an institution. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching her. The lamplight caught the silver threads now woven through her honey-brown hair, and he thought she had never been more beautiful. The girl's vulnerability had been refined into a woman's profound strength. "You're working late," he said, his voice a gentle rumble. She looked up, a tired but radiant smile gracing her face. Just finalizing the plans for the new family wing. I want there to be a garden, Kalen, a proper one for the children who stay there. He walked over, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder, his thumb stroking the base of her neck. Then there will be a garden. He looked down at the blueprints, at the careful, thoughtful notes in her handwriting. You amaze me, Alara. You take the worst thing that ever happened to you and you use it to build a lighthouse for other people lost in the same storm. She covered his hand with hers, leaning her cheek against it. I had a guide, she whispered. Someone who saw the lighthouse in me before I even knew it was there. This was their life. A continuous, quiet conversation of mutual support and adoration. They were partners in the truest sense. He handled the vast, complex financial structuring of the foundation, ensuring its endowment was bulletproof, while she shaped its heart and its mission. They debated, they compromised, they always listened. The years turned, marked by first days of school, by family vacations to quiet beaches where Kaylin taught the twins to swim, by Christmases that were a riot of wrapping paper and laughter. There were challenges, of course, teenage rebellions, academic struggles, the normal friction of growing up. When Lara, at 14, went through a phase of dyed black hair and sullen silence, it was Kaylin who could somehow still reach her, sitting with her in her room for hours, not pushing, just being present, until she finally broke down and sobbed about the cruelties of middle school social hierarchies. When Liam, at 16, felt the immense, invisible weight of being Kaylin Thorne's son and heir, it was Alara who took him for long walks in her garden. You don't have to be him, she told her son, her arm linked through his. Your father built a company, that's his story. You get to write your own. The only legacy he truly wants for you is to be a good man. The rest is just details. Liam had looked at her, his father's gray eyes in her own gentle face, and the tension in his shoulders had eased. How did you get so smart, Mom? She smiled. By making a lot of mistakes and by being very lucky. The world outside continued to watch them, a source of endless fascination. They were the Cinderella story, the billionaire and the abandoned wife. But the tabloids never could quite capture the essence of them. They photographed them at galas, Kaylin in a tuxedo, Alara in a stunning gown, and saw a powerful, glamorous couple. They didn't see the man who, just hours before, had been on the floor of his daughter's room, helping her troubleshoot a malfunctioning robot for a science project. They didn't see the woman who, beneath the designer silk, still preferred the feel of soil on her hands and the simple comfort of her old wool coat, now hanging in the back of her closet as a quiet reminder of how far she had come. On the occasion of their 15th wedding anniversary, Kaylin did not throw a lavish party. Instead, he took her away, just the two of them, to a small, secluded cottage on the coast of Maine. It was a world away from their life, windswept, simple and raw. They walked on rocky beaches, the cold Atlantic wind whipping their hair, their hands clasped tightly. They cooked simple meals together in the small kitchen and sat by a crackling fire in the evenings. On their actual anniversary, as the sun set over the water, painting the sky in strokes of violet and orange, Kaylin led her down to the beach. He didn't give her a speech. He simply faced her, the wind tugging at his jacket, and took both her hands in his. Alara, he began, his voice rough with emotion. For the first 45 years of my life, I believed my purpose was to build something that would last. I built companies, towers, fortunes. I thought that was legacy. I was wrong. He squeezed her hands, his gaze holding hers with the same intensity he'd had in that charity gala a lifetime ago. You are my legacy. Liam and Lara are my legacy. The love in our home, the work you do, the people you help, that is what will last. You took a man who was made of stone and you taught him how to live. You gave me a soul. Tears streamed down Alara's face, carried away by the salt spray wind. She saw the boy from the Rust Belt in his eyes, the lonely man in the penthouse, the devoted father, the passionate partner. She saw his entire journey, and she saw her own reflected back at her. You saw me, she said, her voice trembling but strong. When I was invisible to everyone, even to myself, You looked at me and you saw a person of value. You didn't just give me a child, Kaylin. You gave me back my life. You trusted me with your most vulnerable dream, and in doing so, you made all of my own come true." They stood there, wrapped in each other and the roaring wind, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon. It was not a happy ending because their story wasn't over. It was a happy continuation, a promise of 1,000 more sunsets, 1,000,000 more shared moments. Back home, their legacy was already branching out, becoming its own living thing. Lara, now a bright, passionate university student, was majoring in social work, her life's goal already clear: to take over her mother's foundation one day and expand its reach. Liam, with his quiet, observant nature, was studying sustainable architecture, dreaming of designing buildings that healed the planet, a different kind of empire altogether. The mansion was quieter now, the children's voices echoing from university dorm rooms instead of down the halls, but the love that had built the house remained, a permanent, comforting presence. Ilara's garden was more magnificent than ever, a testament to years of nurturing care. And often on a cool evening you could find them there, Kaylin and Ilara, sitting on their favorite bench, his arm around her, her head on his shoulder, watching the fireflies dance over the lawn their children had played on. They had been given a second chance, both of them, and they had seized it with everything they had. They had taken the shattered pieces of their pasts and together had created a mosaic of breathtaking beauty, a picture of a family, a home, a love that was, in every sense of the word, a masterpiece. And the most beautiful part was that the masterpiece was still being created, its colors deepening, its story forever unfolding, a never-ending testament to the power of trust, the redemption of love, and the unshakable strength of a dignity that had been earned through fire and forged in grace. Theirs was a story that truly would never end. The legacy of Ilara and Kaylin Thorne was not a static monument, but a living, breathing entity that continued to evolve, its roots digging deeper with each passing season. The quiet contentment of their later years was not an absence of story, but a different, richer kind of narrative, one written in the steady rhythm of shared mornings, and the profound understanding that passes between two people who have navigated the deepest valleys and highest peaks together. The empty nest that so many dreaded became, for them, a new chapter of rediscovery. The sprawling house, once filled with the joyous cacophony of children and dogs, now held a different music. The soft rustle of the morning newspaper, the quiet clink of coffee cups, the comfortable silence of two souls perfectly attuned. Ilara found she didn't miss the chaos, but rather cherished the evidence of it. The faint pencil marks on the doorframe charting Liam and Lara's growth, the scuff mark on the floor from a runaway toy truck, the vibrant, slightly crooked childhood paintings that still adorned the walls of Kaylin's home office. It was in this new quiet that Kaylin began a project he'd secretly been planning for years. He purchased the derelict community center in the very neighborhood where Ilara had grown up, the one she'd spoken of with a fond, wistful sadness as it had fallen into disrepair. He didn't tell her. For months, he worked with architects and designers, not to create a gleaming Thorne-branded facility, but to restore the soul of the old place. He insisted on keeping the original brick facade, the worn wooden floors in the gymnasium, even the dusty stage where a young Ilara had once been in a school play. He modernized it invisibly: new plumbing, a state-of-the-art kitchen, bright, energy-efficient lighting, but its heart remained untouched. On the morning of her 55th birthday, he blindfolded her gently and drove her there. "Kaylin, this is ridiculous," she laughed, her hand trustingly in his. When he removed the blindfold, she stood before the beautifully restored building, its doors thrown open. A new, simple sign hung above the entrance: the Ilara Center for New Beginnings. She stepped inside, her hand flying to her mouth. It was all there, the memories, preserved and honored, but infused with new purpose. There was a legal aid clinic run by her foundation, a brightly lit daycare for single mothers, a commercial-grade teaching kitchen for culinary job training, and yes, a large, sun-drenched room that opened onto a newly planted community garden. "He said you gave him a soul," a voice said softly from behind her. It was Lara, who had flown home secretly for the occasion. Liam was there too, smiling beside his sister. "But we all know, Mom, that you showed him what a soul was for." Alara turned to Kaelin, tears streaming down her face, not of sadness but of overwhelming, profound completion. He hadn't just given her a gift, he had given her past meaning. He had taken the landscape of her struggle and turned it into a sanctuary for others. It was the ultimate act of love, not just loving who she was, but loving and redeeming where she had come from. This pattern of quiet, profound gestures became the hallmark of their later years. When Kaelin began to struggle with the relentless pace of the corporate world, feeling the first true aches of age in his bones, it was Alara who gently guided him toward a succession plan. It was she who saw that Liam, for all his brilliance in sustainable design, had no desire to run the Thorn conglomerate, and that the weight of it was beginning to dim the light in her husband's eyes. "Let it go, Kaelin," she told him one evening as they sat in her garden. "You built it. It's done. Your name is on the door of 100 buildings, but your fingerprints are on the hearts of your family. That's the empire that matters now." With her steady encouragement, he began the careful, complex process of transitioning the company to a hand-picked, ethical leadership team, turning the Thorn Group into one of the largest employee-owned corporations in the world. The headlines were staggering, but for Kaelin, the real victory was the deep, settling peace he felt the first Monday morning he woke up with nowhere he had to be. He spent that day, and many after, simply helping Alara in the garden, his hands, once used to signing billion-dollar deals, now content to weed the flower beds. Their love deepened into a partnership of such seamless unity that they often seemed to communicate without words. A glance across a room could convey an entire conversation. A touch of the hand could soothe a forgotten anxiety. They traveled not to see and be seen, but to simply be together, walking the hills of Tuscany, watching the northern lights in Iceland, exploring ancient temples in Cambodia. They were students of the world and of each other, still discovering new layers even after all their years together. The circle of their legacy widened with the arrival of the next generation. Lara, true to her word, took over the day-to-day leadership of the foundation, bringing a new, fiery energy and a tech-savvy approach that expanded its reach globally. She fell in love with a gentle, soft-spoken teacher, and their wedding was a joyful, boisterous affair held in the garden her mother had planted. When Lara gave birth to a daughter, naming her Alara, the circle felt complete. Watching Kaelin, his hair fully silver now, hold his tiny granddaughter with a look of utter, beatific wonder, was a sight that filled Alara's heart to bursting. Liam, meanwhile, found his own path to legacy. His architectural firm, dedicated entirely to green, affordable, and community-centric housing, won international acclaim. His most proud project was the redesign of the public housing complex where his mother had spent her earliest years. He didn't tear it down, he transformed it, adding green spaces, communal areas, and solar panels, treating the residents not as subjects of a project, but as partners in the design. He married an environmental lawyer, and their life was one of quiet, purposeful work, far from the glare of the Thorn name, which was exactly how he wanted it. As the years advanced, time began to leave its gentle, inevitable marks. Kaelin's stride, once so powerful and decisive, slowed to a more measured pace. Alara's hands, though still skilled in the garden, sometimes ached in the cold, but the beauty they had built only seemed to intensify, burnished by the softening light of time. Their greatest joy was found in the simple, cumulative weight of a shared life, the memory of 1,000 family dinners, the sound of their grandchildren's laughter echoing their own children's, the profound comfort of knowing every creak of the house in the night. One crisp autumn afternoon, they sat on their familiar garden bench, wrapped in a shared blanket. The leaves were a blaze of gold and red, and the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Alara's head rested on Kaelin's shoulder, her hand in his. "Do you remember," she said softly, "that day in the courtroom, the smell of the lemon polish, the way the light came through that dirty window?" He nodded, his cheek against her hair. "I remember. I remember thinking my life was a closed book." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know the most beautiful chapters were still unwritten, that they were waiting for you." She squeezed his hand. "We built a good life, Kaelin." "It's more than good, my love," he whispered, his gaze sweeping over the garden, the house, the invisible but palpable presence of their children and grandchildren. "It's a masterpiece." And it was. A masterpiece not of a single dramatic moment, but of a million small choices. Choices to trust, to respect, to endure, to forgive, to love. It was a story that proved that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you have the courage to build. That wealth is not what you accumulate, but what you give away. And that the greatest love stories are not those that are easy, but those that are earned, forged in the fires of past sorrows and cooled in the gentle waters of present grace. They sat there as the sun began to set, painting the sky in the same shades of gold and violet as it had on a beach in Maine so many years before. The story of Kaelin and Alara Thorne was a tale that would be told in their family for generations, a modern-day fable of a childless tycoon and an abandoned wife who trusted each other with their broken pieces, and in doing so, built a legacy of love that would long outlive them. It was a story that truly would never end, its echo continuing in every life they had touched, in every seed of hope they had planted, in every heart that learned from their example that it is never too late to find your way home. The legacy of Kaelin and Alara Thorne did not fade with the passing years. It deepened, like the roots of the ancient oak that stood sentinel in their garden. Their story became a quiet legend, not of wealth or power, but of transformation, a testament to the alchemy that can occur when brokenness meets grace. The world saw the public milestones. The Thorne Foundation, under Lara's dynamic leadership, launched a global initiative pairing abandoned women with legal and mental health resources, a program so successful it became a model for governments. Liam's architectural firm won the Pritzker Prize for his revolutionary work in community-centric, sustainable housing, an honor he quietly accepted before immediately returning to a project site. The media, ever hungry for a simple narrative, still occasionally trotted out the Cinderella and the Billionaire headline, but the story had long since outgrown that simplistic frame. True story, the one that mattered, was lived in the quiet spaces between the headlines. It was in the rhythm of their days, a rhythm that had slowed into a gentle, profound adagio. Kaelin, now fully retired, had discovered a passion for watercolor painting. His subjects were never boardrooms or cityscapes, but the intimate details of his life. Alara's hands arranging sunflowers in a vase, the gnarled bark of the old oak tree, the sun dappling through the kitchen window onto their well-worn wooden table. His style was untrained, sometimes clumsy, but it was filled with a feeling that no master could replicate, a deep, abiding gratitude for the simple beauty of his world. Alara, her hair an elegant silver crown, found her pace slowing as well. The massive community garden at the Alara Center became her primary canvas. She was often found there, not directing, but working alongside the women, her presence a calm, steadying force. She'd kneel in the soil, showing a young mother how to tell if a tomato was ripe, her touch gentle, her words few. She had become a living archetype of resilience, her very presence a silent sermon that it was possible to be broken and yet become whole again, that sorrow could be composted into strength. Their love in this autumn of their lives became a thing of even more profound simplicity and depth. They had long since passed the need for constant conversation. They could sit for an hour on their garden bench, reading or simply watching the birds, their silence a comfortable, shared language. A touch of a hand, a meeting of eyes across a room, these were the punctuation marks of their ongoing dialogue. They had navigated the turbulent waters of early trust, the joyful chaos of raising a family, and now they had arrived at this serene, wide ocean of mutual understanding. The challenges of age arrived as they must, but they faced them as they had faced everything else, together. When Kalen needed a knee replacement, Alara turned his recovery room into a sanctuary, filling it with his favorite books and his own watercolor paintings. She bullied him through the physical therapy with a gentle firmness he adored, and he, in turn, never complained, his love for her giving him a patience he'd never possessed in business. When a scare with Alara's heart sent them to the emergency room, a fleeting, terrifying echo of Lara's childhood fever, Kalen did not fall apart. He held her hand, his grip as steady as it had been decades before, his voice a low, constant murmur of reassurance. In that sterile, frightening room, they were once again just Alara and Kalen, two souls who had chosen each other against all odds, their bond the one unshakable reality in an uncertain world. The diagnosis was minor, a medication adjustment, but the experience served as a poignant reminder of their mortality, making the days they had left all the more precious. Their home became the vibrant, chaotic heart of the extended Thorne family. Sunday dinners were a mandated sacred event. The large farmhouse table Kalen had commissioned years ago groaned under the weight of food and laughter. Lara, her teacher husband, and their bright, inquisitive daughter, little Alara, would bring stories from the classroom and the foundation. Liam, his lawyer wife, and their two quiet, observant sons would share tales of building sites and environmental law. The house would ring with the sound of overlapping conversations, the clatter of cutlery, and the uninhibited laughter of grandchildren. It was during one of these dinners that Lara, now a force of nature in her own right, looked down the table at her parents. Kalen was patiently showing his grandsons a simple magic trick, his eyes crinkling with delight at their amazed gasps. Alara was listening, her head tilted, as her granddaughter explained a complex social dilemma from the 5th grade. "Look at them," Lara said softly to her brother. "After everything, all the pain they both carried, it's all gone, it's just love." Liam followed her gaze, a slow smile spreading across his face. "They didn't just find love, Lara, they built it. They built it like Dad built his companies, with intention, with hard work, with a relentless focus on the foundation." He nodded toward their parents. "That's the real Thorne legacy, not the stock portfolio or the buildings, it's that." As the years continued their inexorable march, the world outside began to formally recognize the quiet revolution Kalen and Alara had wrought. Kalen was offered a Presidential Medal of Freedom, not for his business acumen, but for his revolutionary work in employee ownership and his lifelong anonymous philanthropy. He declined the public ceremony, but accepted the honor in a private letter, writing that his true freedom had been found not in the boardroom, but in his own home. Alara, too, was sought after, her name synonymous with dignity and empowerment. Universities offered her honorary degrees, organizations begged her to speak. She accepted a few, always choosing the smaller, more intimate venues. She never worked from a script. She would simply tell her story, the story of the woman in the courtroom, the man in the penthouse, and the improbable trust that bloomed between them. She always ended the same way. "Your value is not determined by the people who leave you," she would say, her voice clear and steady, her gaze sweeping over the audience, meeting the eyes of women who saw their own reflection in her. "It is inherent. It is yours. Sometimes it takes someone else to see it before you can see it yourself, but I promise you it is there. Be still. Listen for it. And when you find it, build your new life upon it, brick by brick." One afternoon, on the cusp of winter, they took their usual walk through the dormant garden. The air was cold and sharp, the branches of the trees etched like lace against a gray sky. Kalen moved a little slower now, leaning slightly on the polished walnut cane Liam had carved for him. Alara walked beside him, her arm linked through his, matching her pace to his. They stopped at their bench but did not sit. Instead, they looked out over the landscape of their life. The house, warm and inviting against the gray day. The garden, sleeping but pregnant with the promise of spring. "It's been a good life, Kaelin," Alara said, the words a soft cloud in the cold air. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, solid and immovable as the earth beneath their feet. Kaelin turned to her, his face a roadmap of their years together, the laugh lines etched deep, the brow that had once been perpetually furrowed in concentration now smooth. He took her mittened hands in his gloved ones. "It has been more than I ever dreamed possible," he said, his voice rough with an emotion that time had not diminished. "You are more than I ever dreamed possible." He didn't see the silver-haired woman before him. He saw the brave, broken woman in the courtroom. He saw the radiant mother-to-be in the clinic. He saw the fierce advocate in the foundation boardroom. He saw the gentle gardener, the loving grandmother, his partner, his friend, his entire world. "I would choose you," he whispered, the words meant for her alone. "In every version of reality, in every lifetime, I would find you and I would choose you." Tears, warm against the cold, gathered in Alara's eyes. She saw the lonely Titan in the penthouse. She saw the nervous father-to-be on his knees. She saw the patient teacher, the doting grandfather, the man who had taught her that trust was not a weakness, but the greatest strength of all. "And I would trust you," she answered, her voice steady and sure. "I would always trust you." They stood there for a long time, two figures against the fading light, their joined hands a bridge between their past and their future. Their story was nearing its final, peaceful chapters, but its music would play on. It would play in the work of their children, in the laughter of their grandchildren, in the communities they had helped to heal and strengthen. The legacy of Kaelin and Alara Thorne was not a thing to be read about in books or measured in monuments. It was a living, breathing force, a testament to the power of second chances, the redemption found in unexpected love, and the unshakable truth that from the most shattered of beginnings, the most beautiful lives can be built. It was a story that would never truly end, its echo a permanent, comforting hum in the universe, a reminder that love, in the end, is the only legacy that truly lasts.